Okay, so get this right. The CIA spent decades investigating psychic spies.
Psychic spies?
Yeah, remote viewing they called it. Seeing things miles away with your mind. You'd think that was just for, like, the movies, right?
Right.
But the U.S. government was seriously looking into this stuff, like for real-world intelligence gathering.
Wow.
You've got declassified documents, a whole 1995 report breaking down their 20-year research program. So we're going to go through all of it, all the details, and try to figure out, did the CIA actually think psychic spies were a thing? And how could this possibly affect regular people like us?
It is kind of wild to think about, right? But, you got to remember the context. This was the Cold War. The U.S. was worried, like really worried, that the Soviets were already using psychic powers for spying, so they felt like they had to keep up.
Right, like a psychic arms race, basically.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. What did the CIA report actually say? Did they find proof that remote viewing works?
Well, the report goes deep into a lot of research that the government funded. They even had scientists analyze it all. And get this, the analysis showed statistically significant results.
Wait, hold on. Statistically significant. Are you saying there's evidence, like actual evidence, that people can see things with their minds?
It's not quite that simple, though. To really get what they found, we need to understand how these experiments actually worked.
Okay, so break it down for us.
All right, so they'd have someone, they called him the viewer, try to psychically describe a place that they couldn't see at all, like a random spot somewhere out in the ocean, or maybe like some hidden base.
Okay, so somewhere totally unknown.
Yeah. And to make it even harder, they'd throw in fake targets, they called them decoys, to see if the viewer could pick out the real one.
So they're really trying to see if these viewers can pick up genuine information, not just lucky guesses.
Yeah.
Okay, that's actually pretty clever. But how do you actually measure how accurate someone is at seeing with their mind?
Right. Well, that's where all that statistical analysis comes in. They used a measure called effect size, which basically tells you how much better someone is doing than if they were just randomly guessing. And in a lot of the experiments, those effect sizes were definitely bigger than just chance.
Okay, that is interesting, I have to admit. But even if the statistics show something's up, does that mean it's automatically remote viewing? Couldn't there be other explanations for it?
That's exactly the point where the two scientists who were reviewing the whole program disagreed.
Oh, there were two of them.
Yeah. One was Dr. Jessica Utz, a statistician. She thought the numbers, they were pointing to a real phenomenon. But she even said it wasn't definitive proof, that more research was needed to, rule out mistakes or other factors.
So one scientist is saying, hey, the stats are interesting, but let's not jump to conclusions. What about the other scientist? Were they buying it?
The other scientist was Dr. Ray Hyman, and he was more of a skeptic. He was a psychologist who studies how people can be fooled, like especially in these kinds of, paranormal experiments.
Okay, so he's coming at it from a different angle.
Yeah. He said, sure, there were those statistically significant results, but that doesn't automatically mean it's psychic powers at work.
Right.
He said there could be problems with how they actually ran the experiments, or maybe unconscious biases were affecting the results, things like that.
That makes sense. Just because you see a pattern doesn't mean you know what's actually causing it. Right?
Exactly. And that's actually a big problem for a lot of research into, psychic abilities. You need super tight controls, really strict rules to rule out all the normal explanations. And that's really hard when you're dealing with something as strange as, the human mind.
So the CIA is doing all this research, getting these statistically significant results. But did they ever actually try to UEC remote viewing for spying? Like real-world missions and stuff?
Oh, they did, absolutely. They wanted to see if these remote viewers could actually give them useful intel on, enemy locations or maybe missing people, even get this, future events.
Wait, they were trying to see into the future with this stuff? That's a whole other level of crazy.
They were exploring all sorts of applications, but, think about it. How do you actually prove someone's accurately seeing the future? That's even harder than proving regular remote viewing.
Okay, so they're training these viewers, they're giving them actual targets. What happened? Did they get any useful information?
To try and figure that out, they did something called blind evaluations. So basically, analysts would get these remote viewing reports, but they wouldn't actually know what the target was.
Oh, that's smart. That keeps them from being biased, right? Like, oh, I know this viewer is good, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly. They were trying to be as objective as possible. And what they found was, a lot of times, these reports were kind of vague. And they weren't always consistent. And sometimes it seemed like they were influenced by stuff the viewers already knew, even if they weren't aware of it.
So it's like, even if they were picking up something psychically, it was mixed in with a lot of other mental clutter. That would make it really hard to use for something as serious as espionage. You need solid intel, not just vague feelings.
Think about trying to find, like, a hidden weapons facility. You need really precise information, not a bunch of vague images or hunches.
Exactly. And in those situations, you can't afford to be wrong, right? You need certainty, not maybe or it feels like.
And that's a big part of why the CIA ended up shutting down the program in 1995. They basically concluded that remote viewing, at least how they were doing it, wasn't reliable enough to actually use in real operations. They couldn't get the actionable intel that they needed.
So even though there were those interesting statistical results, they couldn't make it work out in the real world.
That's basically the takeaway from their evaluation. But the whole debate about whether remote viewing is actually real or not, that's still going on today.
Okay, so the CIA closed the book on psychic spies. But the story isn't over. Hold on, though. If they were using these remote viewers in real-world missions, there must have been some times when it seemed like it was working, right?
Oh, yeah. The report does mention real-world cases.
Cases, okay, like what?
Like there's one where a viewer was asked to locate a specific person. And they gave descriptions of buildings, a body of water, even the type of aircraft there. And some of those details actually match the person's location. But not all of them.
So a partial hit? It seems like that's pretty common with these kinds of stories, right? Something's right, something's wrong, and it's hard to tell if it's really psychic ability or just dumb luck.
Right. And the report itself admits it's hard to judge these real-world cases because they didn't always have tight control over the information the viewers got. And there's always a chance they were influenced by stuff they already knew, even subconsciously.
So even when a remote viewing session seems successful, there's always that question mark.
Yeah.
That makes it even harder to use for intelligence work, for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. The CIA wanted a source of information they could count on. And remote viewing, the way they were doing it at least, didn't meet that standard.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the targets and the reports and all that, but what about the people involved? The viewers, the ones claiming these abilities, what were their backgrounds? What was it like for them?
Well, the report talks about how they recruited and trained the viewers. What's interesting is that a lot of them had backgrounds in, like, intelligence or the military.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which makes you wonder if that knowledge and their experiences were somehow influencing their viewing results.
It makes sense that they would pick people who already knew something about intelligence work.
Yeah.
But like you said before, that could also lead to bias.
Oh, absolutely.
If a viewer already knows something about the target, it's hard to tell if their psychic impressions are real or just based on what they already know.
That's one of the criticisms that Dr. Hyman, the skeptic, he brought up.
Right.
He said that without super strict controls to rule out that kind of bias, you just can't be sure if the viewers are really getting information psychically or just through normal channels.
So we're back to the need for good science.
Yeah.
Even if the viewers believe in their abilities and even if they get some hits, you still have to rule out every other explanation.
Absolutely. And that's like a huge problem for parapsychology in general, the study of psychic phenomena. It's hard to design experiments that are sensitive enough to pick up these subtle psychic effects, but are also rigorous enough to eliminate all the possible mistakes and biases.
Well, it sounds like the CIA took this seriously, even if the results didn't exactly match their hopes. But this whole remote viewing thing, it brings up some pretty big questions, doesn't it? About consciousness itself, I mean.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like if people really can perceive things beyond their five senses, that changes how we understand the world, and our place in it.
Absolutely. Even though the CIA was focused on spying, their research kind of accidentally touched on some pretty fundamental questions about, reality and what our minds are actually capable of.
Okay, now we're getting deep.
Right.
But it's important to remember that we're still dealing with a lot of unknowns here. The CIA's investigation, it was just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. Their program, even with, all its flaws, it did help to move the scientific study of remote viewing forward, at least a little bit. It gave us valuable data, and it showed us how hard it is to study this stuff, methodologically, I mean. And, it sparked a debate that's still going on.
And it definitely sparks the imagination. Who hasn't wondered if there's more to our minds than we know?
That question has fascinated people for centuries. The CIA's attempt at psychic espionage, even though it didn't really succeed the way they hoped, it reminds us that there are mysteries out there. Mysteries waiting to be solved.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The history of the CIA's remote viewing program, how they did the research, what they found, what the scientists thought about it all. But what does it all mean? What can we, regular people, take away from all this talk about psychic spies?
I think the biggest takeaway is just to think critically, especially when you're hearing extraordinary claims. The CIA research, it shows us that just because something sounds amazing or unbelievable, that doesn't make it true or false. We have to look at the evidence, consider different viewpoints, and be willing to question what we think we know.
That's a great point. It's easy to get swept up in the excitement of something like remote viewing, but it's important to approach it with, a healthy amount of skepticism and a commitment to, good science.
Totally. And that goes for everything, not just remote viewing. We're constantly bombarded with information, so we need to be able to tell fact from fiction and form our own, informed opinions.
Well said. So while the CIA's search for psychic spies might not have panned out the way they hoped, it definitely gives us a lot to think about. It reminds us that there's still SOMUCH we don't know about the human mind and the universe.
Who knows? Maybe someday, with more research, and a better understanding of consciousness, we'll be able to unlock the secrets of remote viewing and other, seemingly impossible abilities.
That's an amazing thought. Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive into the CIA and remote viewing, I have one last, thought-provoking question for you.
You have all ears. What's the question?
What if remote viewing did work? I mean, really worked? Consistently and reliably, how would that change our world? How would it affect your life, your relationships, your sense of privacy? Would it be a gift, a curse, or something in between?
That's a really interesting question, for sure.
It challenges us to imagine a world where the lines between our minds and the physical world, they're blurred, where the secrets of consciousness are revealed, and where the impossible becomes possible.
That's deep.
And on that note, we'll leave you to contemplate the mysteries of the mind and the incredible potential of human consciousness.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe we do have these untapped abilities, that the world can be way stranger than we think. But okay, back to reality for a sec. If the CIA was so serious about using remote viewing for spying, why wouldn't they have kept it all top secret? Why release all these documents at all?
That's a good point. If they thought they had a real psychic weapon on their hands, you'd think they'd lock it up tight, right?
Right.
So why make this public?
Well, there are a few theories floating around about that. Some folks think that declassifying all these documents was the CIA's way of kind of distancing themselves from the whole program. It got controversial, maybe even a little embarrassing, So releasing the information was a way to say, hey, look, we tried it. It didn't work. We're moving on.
So kind of a way to control the narrative and avoid looking bad.
Exactly. By releasing it themselves, they could spin it as oh, it was just a failed science experiment, rather than admitting they maybe wasted a bunch of money on something that a lot of people thought was, out there.
It's fascinating how the release of information can be used in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
Debunk something to make it seem more legit, or even to just muddy the waters completely. But okay, let's focus back on the people who were actually involved. What happened to those remote viewers after the CIA shut the whole program down?
Well, a lot of them kept practicing and teaching remote viewing. They really believed it had real potential, even if the CIA decided it didn't work out for their purposes. Some of them wrote books, gave lectures, even offered training courses, sharing their experiences with anyone who was curious about this stuff.
So they weren't put off by the CIA's skepticism at all. They still believed in what they were doing.
For a lot of them, their personal experiences were just too powerful to ignore. They'd seen things, felt things that convinced them something real was happening, even if it wasn't always perfect or reliable, especially in those lab settings.
I can see how that would be tough to dismiss. If you had these firsthand experiences that you can't explain, you're not just going to brush them off as imagination.
Right. And for some of those viewers, the CIA program was just one part of their journey with remote viewing. They kept exploring it on their own, trying to figure out how it worked, get better at it, maybe even find new ways to use it outside of government spying.
That's an interesting twist, for sure. It shows you how strong personal belief can be, even when you're facing official skepticism and rejection from a powerful organization like the CIA. But let's circle back to the CIA's findings for a minute. You mentioned that the remote viewing results were often pretty vague and inconsistent. Can you give us a sense of what those remote viewing reports actually looked like? Were they super detailed or more like abstract impressions?
It really depended on the viewer and what they were trying to view, honestly. Some viewers were very visual. They described shapes, colors, textures, even specific objects they saw. Others were more focused on feelings, emotions, or kind of abstract concepts they associated with the target.
So it wasn't like they were watching a crystal clear video in their minds. More like piecing together a puzzle from vague clues and, like, gut feelings.
That's a great way to put it. The viewers often described it as a kind of psychic detective work. They had to sift through a lot of mental noise to find the real signal, the important information. And sometimes that signal was really weak or distorted, making it super hard to understand.
That makes sense. It's like trying to listen to a radio station with a ton of static. You might catch a few words here and there, but you're never really sure if you're getting the full message.
Exactly. And that's one of the criticisms of remote viewing, that it's too subjective, too open to interpretation. What one person sees as a hit, someone else might say is a total miss.
So it's kind of like abstract art, where beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
In a way, yeah. Trying to make sense of remote viewing data, it often involves some degree of subjective interpretation, and that makes it really hard to study scientifically, where you're looking for, objective and measurable results.
It sounds like the CIA was in a tough spot, right? Intrigued by remote viewing's potential, but also struggling to make it fit their need for, rock-solid, reliable intelligence.
They were trying to, reconcile two totally different ways of understanding the world. The intelligence world, it wants certainty, hard facts that you can use to make decisions. But remote viewing, it's all about the unknown, intuitions, subjective experiences. That fundamental clash, it's ultimately what led to the program's downfall.
Like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Trying to force something that's inherently fuzzy and subjective into this rigid, objective framework.
Exactly. And it highlights a bigger challenge that often pops up when science tries to investigate things that fall outside of our normal understanding. Sometimes the tools and methods that work great in other areas of science, they just aren't the right fit for something as complex and slippery as, psychic abilities.
It makes you wonder if there's a fundamental mismatch between the scientific method, which relies on repeatability and controlled conditions, and the study of consciousness itself, which is inherently subjective, fluid, always changing. How do you measure something that's constantly in flux?
That's a question that philosophers and scientists have been arguing about for ages. It's possible that our current scientific tools, they just aren't up to the task of fully understanding consciousness, especially when it comes to stuff like remote viewing that seems to break the laws of physics as we know them.
So maybe we need a whole new way of thinking about consciousness, a new set of tools and methods that can actually handle its subjective and elusive nature. It's like trying to study a dream with a microscope, right? You need different tools for different realms of reality.
Maybe that's one of the, unintended legacies of the CIA's remote viewing program, It pushed the boundaries of scientific inquiry. It forced us to confront the limits of what we know and consider the possibility that there's so much more to the human mind than we currently grasp.
It's like they accidentally opened a door to a whole new realm of possibilities, even if they couldn't fully explore it themselves. They gave us this glimpse of something extraordinary, something that challenges our most basic assumptions about reality and what's possible, but gotta be careful not to get too carried away, right?
Right.
Let's bring it back down to earth for a second. We've talked about the viewers, the targets, the kinds of reports they were producing, but who was actually judging all of this? Who decided if a remote viewing session was a hit or a miss?
Oh, that's a crucial part of the whole thing, for sure. The CIA had analysts, their job was to actually look at these remote viewing reports and decide if they were accurate and if they were actually useful for intelligence work,
So they were like the judges on a psychic talent show, deciding who had the real gift and who was just faking it.
Well, it was a little more nuanced than that. They weren't looking for talent in the traditional sense. They were trying to figure out if the information the viewers were giving them, if it could be verified by other intel sources, or if it offered some kind of unique insight that might be helpful for actual operations.
So they were looking for, real-world intel, not just impressive psychic parlor tricks. Did these analysts have any special training, though, in how to actually judge this kind of unconventional data?
That's actually a point of contention, to be honest. Some people criticize the program, saying that the analysts, they weren't adequately trained to actually evaluate remote viewing data, which, as we talked about, is super subjective and open to interpretation,
Yeah.
They argued that without clear guidelines and some objective criteria, it's just too easy for biases to sneak in. like personal biases and preconceived ideas.
That makes sense. You'd need specific expertise to be able to judge this kind of data, right? It's not like analyzing satellite photos or intercepted messages. You're dealing with a whole different type of information, something rooted in intuition and psychic perception.
Totally. And that was one of the hurdles the CIA faced, trying to integrate remote viewing into their like traditional intelligence methods. It required them to shift their thinking, to be willing to consider information that came from, a non-traditional source and couldn't always be easily verified.
So it sounds like the CIA was walking this tightrope, trying to embrace the potential of remote viewing while also maintaining the rigor and objectivity that's needed for, serious intelligence gathering. Did they ever find that balance, though?
It's tough to say, honestly. The CIA's own conclusion was that even though there were some statistically significant results in the lab, the program just didn't consistently produce the kind of reliable, actionable intel they needed in real-world situations.
So back to that tension between promising lab results and actual practical applications.
Yeah.
What about the analysts themselves? Did they think this whole thing was worthwhile? Or did they see it as, a waste of time and resources?
The interviews they did for the CIA's evaluation show that, opinions varied, just like with the viewers. Some thought remote viewing had real potential, like it could become a valuable tool for intel if they researched it more and refined the methods. Others were way more skeptical. They doubted the results were actually reliable and consistent, and they questioned if the information was really unique or valuable at all.
It's fascinating that even within the intelligence community, there were these totally different views on remote viewing. It seems like this whole debate boils down to a really fundamental question about human perception. Like what do we really know about how our minds work?
You hit the nail on the head. The CIA's remote viewing program, whether you think it was a success or a failure, it forced us to confront the limits of our knowledge and consider the possibility that, hey, maybe there's more to the universe than meets the eye. It makes us question the very nature of reality, really.
That's a pretty profound legacy for a program that ultimately got shut down. It's like they stumbled onto these questions that have puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries.
Exactly, and those questions are still relevant today, Long after the CIA wrapped up their program, we're still searching for answers, trying to unravel the mysteries of consciousness and understand just what the human mind is capable of.
It really makes you wonder what other secrets might be hidden away in our minds, just waiting to be uncovered. But okay, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We've discussed the people involved, but what about the actual research itself? I think we should dive into the methods they used, the experiments, the data, the conclusions that the CIA reached in their, scientific evaluation of remote viewing. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of how they tested for these abilities. What were the protocols, the controls? How did they try to figure out if this stuff was real or just wishful thinking?
Okay, so the CIA's research, it involved a whole bunch of different experimental methods, all designed to test if people could really perceive information about distant targets using like something other than their normal senses.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. So walk us through a typical remote viewing experiment. What did it actually look like?
Okay, picture this, right? You have a viewer, someone who says they have remote viewing abilities. They're sitting in a room, totally cut off from any info about the target. No peeking allowed, no hints, no internet searches, nothing.
So they're going in totally blind.
Totally blind. And then in another location, could be miles away, you have the target. And that target could be anything, really. A photograph, an object, a place on a map, even another person.
Okay, you've got the viewer in one place, the target in another. What happens next? How do they connect psychically, I mean?
Well, that's where things get interesting. They tried a few different things. One common method was to use a sender, someone who was actually at the target location physically, and they would focus all their attention on it, like trying to transmit information to the viewer psychically.
So like a mental telephone line.
Yeah.
The sender's broadcasting and the viewer's trying to tune in.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. The sender would concentrate on the target's details, what it looked like, felt like, smelled like, even the emotions they were feeling while being there.
Wow, that's wild. What about the viewer, though? How do they receive that information? Are we talking like crystal balls and Ouija boards here?
No, nothing quite that dramatic. Usually the viewer would relax, maybe meditate, and they would just try to sense information about the target. Let the impressions come to them without, forcing it or overthinking.
So they're not actively trying to see the target in their mind's eye. It's more about letting the information kind of bubble up from their subconscious.
Exactly. They often described it as a kind of, intuitive knowing where information would come through as images, feelings, words, or even these abstract concepts.
So it's not like a clear mental picture, more like a dream state where bits and pieces of information drift through their awareness.
That's a good way to think about it. They'd report this jumble of sensory impressions, emotions, even seemingly random thoughts, and then they'd try to put it all together like a puzzle to form a picture of the target.
Okay, so the viewer has these impressions. Then what? Do they just shout it out?
They'd record all their impressions either by speaking out loud or writing them down. And that would create a, remote viewing report. And that report could include sketches, descriptions, even just this stream of consciousness narrative of everything that came to them during the session.
So they're documenting their psychic journey, basically.
Yeah, I could say that. And these reports, this mix of accurate details, vague feelings, and sometimes what seemed like random thoughts, that became the main data that the CIA analysts used to decide if the remote viewing was a success.
Those reports must have been really tricky to interpret, though, right? Like, how do you tell what's a real psychic hit and what's just coincidence or imagination or stuff they already knew subconsciously?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what makes the CIA's research so fascinating. They weren't content with just collecting stories, They wanted to use real scientific methods to try to isolate a genuine psychic signal from all the mental noise.
So they brought in the statisticians, the data crunchers, the people who weren't afraid to be skeptical.
Exactly. They wanted to develop protocols and methods that could actually distinguish real psychic ability from, lucky guesses or subconscious biases.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of that science side of things. What were some of the techniques they actually used to test for remote viewing?
One common method was what they called target ranking. So in these experiments, they'd give the viewer a set of, let's say, 5 photographs or 5 descriptions. One of those was the real target. The other 4 were decoys, similar but not exactly the same as the real one.
So like a multiple choice test for psychics.
Yeah, you could put it that way. The viewer had to rank the 5 options from most to least likely to be the real deal based on whatever impressions they got.
Well, if they were just guessing randomly, they'd have a 1 in 5 chance of getting it right. So what were the researchers looking for to show that something more than just chance was going on?
That's where the statistics come in, right? If the viewers consistently ranked the real target higher than you'd expect if they were just picking randomly, that suggested something unusual might be happening, that they were somehow tapping into information about the target in a way we don't really understand.
So they were looking for patterns in the data, these statistical anomalies that couldn't be explained away by just, chance or coincidence.
Exactly. They used these sophisticated statistical methods to analyze all the results, looking for evidence of a consistent effect that could be linked to remote viewing.
Okay, and did they find any evidence like that?
Well, that's where it gets a little messy, honestly. Some researchers who were involved, they thought the data DID show a statistically significant effect, like suggesting remote viewing might be real. But other scientists, some that the CIA brought in for independent evaluation, they were more skeptical. They argued that those results could actually be explained by, flaws in the experiments themselves, or maybe unconscious biases, other factors that they hadn't accounted for.
So we're back to the age-old question. Is it real, or is it all in their heads? It seems like even with all the science, there's still room for debate and different interpretations.
The CIA's research into remote viewing, while it didn't give us definitive proof, it definitely generated a ton of data. And it sparked a debate that's still going strong. It's a story full of intrigue, scientific curiosity, and, a healthy dose of skepticism.
It makes you wonder what secrets might lie hidden in the depths of human consciousness, just waiting to be uncovered.
Right. And it reminds us that exploring the unknown, while it can be challenging and unpredictable, it can also lead to these really profound insights and a deeper understanding of ourselves and, the universe.
We've talked a lot about the experimental setups, the methods, the statistics, but let's bring it back to the human element for a second.
Sure.
What can you tell us about the viewers themselves? What were their backgrounds, their motivations? What was it like for them to actually be a part of this program?
The CIA, they recruited viewers from all over the place. Some had experience with, psychic stuff. Others had never even encountered anything remotely paranormal before. They came from the military, intelligence agencies, but also from art, from writing, even just regular everyday folks.
So it wasn't just a club for super spies with psychic powers. They were looking for a diverse group of people.
Exactly. They really wanted to know if remote viewing was this rare gift, or if it was a latent ability that anyone could potentially develop with the right training and mindset.
That's interesting. So they brought in this diverse group and then trained them to be psychic spies.
Yep.
What did that training involve?
It really varied depending on the person and when they were involved in the program. Some went through these intensive programs that included like meditation, visualization techniques, stuff designed to, enhance their psychic sensitivity and focus.
So like psychic boot camp.
Yeah, kinda. They were taught how to quiet their minds, how to access their intuition, how to trust the impressions they were getting, even if those impressions seemed, illogical or out there.
That sounds like it would be challenging, especially for people who are more like analytical or skeptical by nature.
You're right, and not everyone who went through the training actually succeeded. Some folks had trouble silencing that inner critic, Some were too quick to dismiss their own impressions, and some, they just didn't seem to have the knack for it, honestly.
It's like any other skill, right? Some people are natural, some have to work at it, and some just never really get it.
Exactly. And even those who showed some real promise, they still faced a lot of challenges. Remember, this isn't a precise science, right? The results can be really unpredictable, and there were definitely no guarantees of success.
It must have been a wild ride for these viewers. One day they're hitting all their targets, the next day they're coming up empty.
That's what a lot of them reported, yeah. They'd have moments of amazing clarity and accuracy, followed by periods of doubt, frustration, even like imposter syndrome, wondering if they were fooling themselves or if they were just getting lucky.
That must have been disorienting, especially knowing their psychic impressions could potentially have these real-world consequences,
The psychological toll on the viewers, that's something that often gets overlooked. They were operating in total secrecy. They faced a lot of skepticism from inside the intelligence community, and they struggled with the uncertainty of their own abilities.
It's like they were pioneers in a field with no map, no compass, and no guarantee of even reaching their destination. But okay, let's switch gears for a bit here. Let's talk about the targets themselves. We've mentioned that they could be anything from photographs to locations. But did the CIA ever try to use remote viewing to learn about things that were like physically hidden or really difficult to access through normal means?
That was one of the big hopes of the program, yeah. They were really hoping to use remote viewing to gather intel on targets that were, beyond the reach of traditional spy methods.
Like trying to see inside a secret bunker in another country or listening in on a high-level meeting happening behind closed doors?
Exactly. They wanted to bypass physical barriers, to penetrate the secrecy that shielded their adversaries from conventional surveillance,
Yeah.
like having X-ray vision for secrets.
Did they have any luck with that, though? Were there any cases where remote viewing actually seemed to provide, unique intel about these hidden targets?
Well, the report mentions a handful of cases where remote viewing, it seemed to give information that other intel sources would later confirm. But as we've said before, these are mostly anecdotal accounts, It's tough to know for sure how accurate they really are. They could be open to a lot of different interpretations.
Like those blurry photos of Bigfoot, right?
Yeah.
You can't really tell what you're looking at, and there are always other possible explanations.
Right. That's a good comparison. The world of psychic phenomena, it's often murky and full of unknowns. Even when you get what seems like a compelling result, there's always that chance that other factors are at play.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that remote viewing does work, at least some of the time. What were some of the biggest obstacles the CIA faced in trying to actually use it for real-world espionage?
One of the biggest issues was consistency. As we've talked about, those remote viewing results, they can be all over the place, even with viewers who seem really skilled. Sometimes they nail it, sometimes they miss completely, and there's no real way to predict when they're going to be successful.
So it's not like flipping a switch. You can't just turn on the psychic powers on demand.
Yeah, exactly. Remote viewing seems to be affected by tons of different things. The viewer's mental state, their emotional state, the type of target they're looking at, even just random environmental factors.
That would make it pretty much impossible to use for, serious intelligence work. Imagine trying to brief the president, Mr. President, our psychic spies, they might be able to tell us what the enemy's planning, but it really depends on how they're feeling today and also what the weather's like.
Yeah, I can see why the CIA would want something a little more dependable, right? They needed intelligence they could count on, not just vague feelings and hunches that might be accurate or might be totally off base.
And even if a viewer gets a hit, the information they give might be too general to be helpful in a practical sense.
That's another key point, absolutely. The intelligence community, they need what they call actionable intel, specific, verifiable info that you can use to make decisions and guide operations. But remote viewing often deals with, Impressions, feelings, intuitive nudges, that stuff can be really hard to translate into concrete, actionable intelligence.
It's like telling a general, our psychic spies say something big is about to happen, but we don't know what, where, or when. Not super helpful for planning a defense strategy.
Exactly. The CIA needed to know stuff like the exact location of enemy troops, the types of weapons they were using, when an attack might happen. Vague feelings about something big just weren't going to cut it.
So even if remote viewing could give them these glimpses into the future or behind enemy lines, it often lacked the specifics that you need for real-world decision-making. It's like having a blurry map with no labels. It might show you the general lay of the land, but you can't use it to actually navigate.
That's a good analogy, and it highlights a key reason why the CIA eventually just decided that remote viewing, while it was fascinating, wasn't a practical tool for the kind of work they do. It just didn't fit their needs.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of consistency and getting specific information. Were there any other hurdles they faced in trying to use remote viewing for, espionage?
Another big one was the whole issue of deception.
Deception. You mean like enemy agents trying to trick the remote viewers?
That's one possibility, but it could also be more subtle than that, even unintentional. Imagine you're a remote viewer and you're tasked with getting info about a specific target. How do you know if the impressions you're getting are genuine, psychic insights, or if they've been planted there, intentionally or not, to mislead you?
So like a psychic version of disinformation. You're getting bad intel, but you don't know where it's coming from.
Exactly. Espionage is all about smoke and mirrors, misleading and manipulating. And when you're dealing with something as, slippery as psychic perception, it gets really hard to tell what's real and what's just a fabrication.
It sounds like the CIA was playing this high-stakes game of psychic chess, where the rules were constantly changing, and they couldn't even be sure if their opponent was playing fair.
That's a good way to put it. The intelligence world is shadowy and full of hidden agendas, right? Where you're trying to use something as unconventional and unpredictable as remote viewing in that environment. Well, it was a huge gamble, and ultimately just didn't pay off.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey into the world of psychic spies, for sure. We've learned about the history of the CIA's program, the science behind it, the challenges, and the reasons why it ultimately didn't live up to that initial promise. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a few final thoughts.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are your takeaways from all this?
First, it's important to remember that the CIA's program, it was just one chapter in a much longer story, right? Humanity's just always been fascinated with psychic phenomena. People have been reporting and exploring these abilities for centuries, and the debate about whether they're real and what they mean, well, that's going to continue.
Totally agree. The CIA's research, even though it didn't give us those clear-cut answers, it definitely helped to move the scientific study of psychic phenomena forward. It pushed us to develop better methods and to really grapple with the challenge of separating genuine psychic effects from chance, and subconscious biases.
Second, I think it's crucial to approach these topics with, a healthy mix of curiosity, A&D skepticism. The world of psychic stuff, it's full of these intriguing possibilities, but it's also full of, scams, wishful thinking, and outright lies. We need to be careful, evaluate the evidence, and be willing to question our own beliefs.
Well said. Critical thinking is so important in all areas of life, but especially when we're dealing with these claims that challenge our fundamental understanding of, how the world works.
And finally, I think the CIA's whole remote viewing program, it reminds us that the universe is still full of mysteries that we just don't fully understand. The human mind, especially, it's this vast and largely uncharted territory. It's possible we have abilities that we're only just starting to glimpse, potentials we haven't even dreamed of yet.
That's a hopeful thought for sure. Maybe one day, with more research and a more open mind, we will unlock the secrets of the mind and learn to actually use the full power of human consciousness.
And maybe, just maybe, we'll discover that some of these abilities, like remote viewing, they aren't as far-fetched as they seem.
Until then, the mystery remains.
On that note, we'll leave you to ponder the possibilities. But we're not done yet. Stick around, because there's a lot more to uncover in part 3 of our deep dive into the CIA and remote viewing. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the CIA and their attempts to, weaponize remote viewing, basically.
Right.
But it's important to remember that their whole perspective on this was super limited.
Oh, for sure.
They were coming at it from a purely practical standpoint. Can we use this to get information? Can we use this to gain an advantage over our enemies?
Right, exactly.
But what if we take a step back from that perspective for a minute? What if we entertain the idea that, hey, maybe remote viewing eye is real? Even if it's, messy and unpredictable, what does that actually tell us about human consciousness itself?
That's a really good point. The CIA, they were so focused on the what and the how that they weren't really equipped to even think about the why or the bigger implications for how we understand ourselves.
Exactly. And that's what I find so fascinating about this whole topic, honestly.
Yeah.
Let's say, just for a second, that the CIA's research actually stumbled onto something genuine, even if they couldn't really control it or use it reliably. What does that tell us about the potential of the human mind?
It challenges pretty much everything we think we know about reality, about what's even possible.
Right.
If we can actually perceive things beyond our immediate sensory experience, if our minds can somehow reach out and touch these distant places and events, that suggests a much much deeper connection than we usually even acknowledge, I think.
It's like our minds aren't just contained within our skulls, but are somehow connected to this larger web of information, a field of consciousness that extends beyond the physical limitations of space and time even.
Exactly. It opens up this whole mind-blowing possibility that we're not just these isolated individuals, but that we're all part of something way vaster and more mysterious than we can currently wrap our heads around.
That's a pretty profound concept when you really think about it.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other hidden abilities we might have, what other potentials are just lying dormant within us, waiting to be unlocked,
And it brings up all these questions about how we could even begin to develop those abilities. How could we harness them? Could we use them for good?
Yeah.
And how do we protect ourselves from the potential for misuse?
We're standing at the edge of this whole new understanding of what it even means to be human.
Yeah.
But even if we put aside those, grand philosophical implications for a second,
Right.
there's still that question of what this means for us as individuals, in our everyday lives.
Right. Let's bring it back down to earth.
Yeah.
Even if we don't become psychic super spies, how might understanding remote viewing or even just the potential for this expanded consciousness change how we live our lives?
Well, for one thing, it might make us a lot more aware of the power of our own minds.
Oh, for sure.
If we can actually learn to quiet down all that mental chatter, to tap into our intuition, to really pay attention to those subtle feelings and impressions that we usually just brush off, who knows what we might discover.
It's like we all have these incredible tools, these psychic senses, but we don't really know how to use them yet.
Right.
Maybe remote viewing is just the tip of the iceberg. A little hint of what we might be capable of if we could just, tune in and actually listen.
It's almost like an invitation, right?
Yeah.
To explore those hidden depths of our own consciousness, to see the world in a totally new light, and to consider possibilities that we might have just, written off as impossible before.
And even if we never get those, mind-blowing, super dramatic results that the CIA was hoping for, even if we never learn to see across continents or into the future or whatever, just cultivating that greater awareness of our inner world, that can be a really transformative experience in itself.
It's about paying attention to our dreams, our intuitions, those weird moments of synchronicity or connection that often seem like, oh, it's just a coincidence.
Right.
Maybe there's actually more to those experiences than we think.
Totally.
It's about approaching life with a sense of wonder, a willingness to, embrace the unknown. And with the understanding that reality itself might be way more flexible and fluid than we've been led to believe.
I like that.
So while the CIA's search for psychic spies, it might not have led to this practical new intelligence tool that they were hoping for. It might have accidentally given us something way more valuable.
Yeah.
A glimpse into this extraordinary potential of human consciousness and an invitation to explore the hidden dimensions of our own minds.
And that's a journey that we can all take, no matter what we believe about, psychic abilities. It's about opening ourselves up to new possibilities, challenging our beliefs, and really embracing the mystery and the wonder that's at the heart of being alive, I think.
That's beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own exploration. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the CIA and remote viewing.